We will have one presentation today by Tom Enslinger with the Texas Water Development Board. Tom performs wide-ranging duties related to the development and management of TWDB infrastructure financing programs. Before joining TWDB, he worked with the Community Development Block Grant Program at the Texas Department of Agriculture, with a focus on drought relief and funding for colonias along the U.S.-Mexico border. Tom holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Texas at El Paso and served as a grant writer for the County of El Paso. Okay, Tom, I am now turning it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to do this webinar today. Big thanks to the North Central Texas COG and to Elena, Renee, Brian, Cassidy, and everyone I've dealt with over there. A lot of good folks at the COG, but I'm sure many of you listening already knew that. So the topic of today's slides is going to be wastewater project financing, but I just want to mention at the top here that we do water financing as well. So those of you who work for utilities that do both, we can work with you on both sides. I also want to point out that by a long shot, we are not the only game in town when it comes to infrastructure project financing. The Water Development Board is one of many funding sources available to you. I can say with some confidence that if your utility is in a situation where you've been looking at taking out a loan to do a project, you've been looking at traditional financing options, we are likely to be the cheapest source of financing that you're going to find. I can say that with some degree of confidence. It usually turns out to be true. The rest of the presentation really is just kind of ways to support that point. The bottom line that we can save money over the life of a loan compared to particularly the open market and many of the other public financing options out there. So the topics and the goals of this presentation are actually pretty modest. I want to introduce the Water Development Board to those of you who are not familiar with our agency. I want to point out a couple of our most popular financing tools. I'll kind of talk to you a little bit about how those tools are being used on wastewater projects in your part of the state. And then, because that probably won't take up all of my time, I'm going to take a moment to brag about some of my coworkers and some of the neat work that they do that helps to support some of the planning processes and things like that that are part of this full cycle. I know that we just heard that this presentation is going to be recorded and posted online, but we actually do some workshops across Texas every month, and our next location is going to be in Arlington, which I think is actually convenient to many of you listening. So the link that's on your screen right now is actually a static link that, regardless of when you're viewing this, you can check the link and see when the next scheduled workshop is. If you miss one in your neck of the woods, you don't have to wait any longer than a year before we come on back. We choose a different city each month, and we hit every region of the state at least once per year. Now, that workshop, if you view the slides today and you think that they were kind of informative, well, that's pretty much what you could expect at the workshop, except that for today's purposes, I've hidden the slides that are specific to water utilities, since I'm kind of presenting on wastewater. So this would essentially be what you would see if you attended one of those workshops. On the topic of workshops, some of you might be listening because you're hoping to get updated information regarding Senate Bill 7 and Senate Bill 8. Those were two very significant pieces of legislation for the Texas Water Development Board in the last legislative session. And I'll just let you know now that I don't plan on addressing those in this presentation, but some workshops across the state, including Arlington and a couple of other places, were just announced yesterday via email, and so you should check out our website if you're interested in those. All right, so without further ado, I will dive on into it. So just to kind of set the stage for those who are not familiar with our agency at all, Texas throughout history has been associated with concepts like fertility and opportunity and growth. This is the kind of place that people have moved to from elsewhere throughout history, to start new lives. And we're associated with things like wildflowers and longhorns and all these wonderful things. And if you've never lived anywhere else, you might take for granted that not everywhere else has this kind of identifiable personality and identity associated with it. But frankly, you also realize that we can't enjoy any of these neat things if we don't have our water resources. And in Texas, that reality has really been brought into sharp focus many times throughout our history, right? Because this is a land that's prone to water supply issues. And so if you were to look, as I did, at the Texas State Historical Commission's website for examples of drought impacts in Texas, you'd find a pretty substantial list. State history really has been touched time and time again by water shortages. Notably in the 1950s, that entire decade was spent in very, very, very severe statewide drought. It's still by many metrics what we refer to as the drought of record. And the legislature in 1956, or in 1957 rather, responded by creating the agency that would become the Texas Water Development Board. And there were two pretty broad mandates at that time. It was get out there and fund water supply projects so that we don't get bit by this again, and also do some statewide water planning so that we know that the projects that we're investing in are the best ones. And we've been doing so ever since. Our first project was the White River Reservoir out in the Panhandle back in 1962. And we have, our responsibilities have really multiplied over time as we kind of knocked out those water supply projects in the early years. But of course, the shortage is not the only type of water issue you can have in your community. Flooding is another thing that happens a lot in Texas. This is a list that actually is no longer up to date because we had some more happen just last year. But again, there's some really dire impacts on our history having to do with flood control. And so water itself is an issue. You can have too much and you can have not enough. Either way, it's a bad situation to be in. And so when they created our agency, what the legislature did was create a toolbox, a funding toolbox for water utilities and wastewater utilities, so that they could get out there and accomplish the projects they knew they needed to accomplish, but the open market financing and things like that just weren't providing enough incentivization. So it's just like your toolbox at home. We have some tools that are very general in their applicability. You can use them for just about anything, like a roll of duct tape or something like that. And then we have very specific tools that you would use for specific applications. And so we have funding programs, funding streams that are specific for things like rural projects. We have specific funding for economically distressed areas, or low-income areas, in other words. We have funding for right-sizing a facility to accommodate future needs. And so just like your toolbox at home, when you put all this together, you get a comprehensive set of tools that once you understand how they work, it's really kind of your imagination is the limit. We're here to help you kind of make sure that they're used correctly and that you're able to accomplish everything you want to accomplish with them. I'm not going to touch all of the programs that you see here on today's presentation. I'm just going to highlight a few of the ones that are best for wastewater financing. And when I say best, I really kind of mean cost savings. But each of these programs kind of has its perks, and the usual workshop would cover a couple more of them. Now, that toolbox might have looked a little cluttered, right? And so let's organize it. You'd have if you were to create piles of these tools, you could organize them based on what's got the federal funding and what's got the state funding. And they make handy little piles because federal funding seems to follow, a certain set of rules. State funding follows another set. But regardless, the benefits that they deliver at the end of the day are pretty consistent. We have a AAA bond rating and interstate subsidization that means, again, cost savings delivered over the life of the project compared to the open market. We can accommodate projects of all sizes, so if you've got a little bit of line that needs replacing or a lift station or something like that, no problem. We have done small projects like that. We have also gone out and paid for the building of a brand new treatment plant and everything in between, really. So there's nothing too small and, frankly, nothing too big. The capacities for the programs I'm going to be talking about are pretty substantial. And we can fund any of the phases that you're coming in for. So you don't have to be what they call shovel ready in order to take a funding commitment from us. We can pay for the initial planning and checking out the different project options and the feasibility analysis, and then the design and the blueprints, even before you ever get to construction. So we can take care of it all. So when we look at the eligible applicants for our funding, nonprofit water supply corporations are going to be treated pretty much the same as like a city or a county or something like that. And so for the purposes of our funding, you're eligible across the board. When we start talking about investor-owned utilities and private entities, it's much, much more limited. In fact, I don't know that I'll really touch on anything today that those kind of utilities would be eligible for. An example of an investor-owned utility, we usually see those serving communities like mobile home parks. It seems to be the common form of organization out there. And then private entities, for things like non-point source pollution control, private entities could mean even like an individual landowner or an individual person. But for the purpose of wastewater projects, that's not really something you'll need to worry about for today's purposes. Now, eligible projects, this is where things start to get kind of confusing. And you might think if you walk into our offices and say, hey, you know, I would like to do some work on the treatment plant, that should be pretty clear. But in fact, there are all different sorts of projects you might want to do, and for many of them, there are many possible funding sources. And the one that's right for you is going to depend on any of a number of different factors, from timing and due dates to bottom line cost savings to maybe a preference for federal or state funding. And so really the point I want to make with this slide is that when you come in and talk to the Water Development Board, you are not expected to be an expert in all of our financing programs. You're not expected to know how all this stuff works. Helping to find the right financing for your utility is part of what we do as part of the initial conversation with you. Now, we have broken up that toolbox into our state-funded pile and our federally funded pile. And so that's kind of how I'm going to walk through here. On the federal-funded side, we have what we call our state revolving fund programs. And the way these are funded is we actually apply for a grant from the EPA each year, and the proceeds from that grant are used to buy down the borrower's interest rates. And so we're able to provide subsidized loans through this program, very, very low interest rates, below 1% in some cases recently. But also partial principal forgiveness is available. And so that's essentially like a partial grant. We can't use the G word in conjunction with the SRF programs, but really that's what it is. And so certain types of projects, which I'll get into here in a moment, would be eligible to have some taken off the top. There's also a powerful multi-year commitment option involved, which means that if you were to take say a $10 million funding commitment through the SRF programs, you would not be required to close on the full $10 million loan that first year. If your project is planned to be phased out, you can actually plan closings adding up to that $10 million over the course of several years, and that allows you to sort of flex along with your project phases. So there are two of these state revolving fund programs. They're sort of seen as counterpoints, the two sides of the coin. The Drinking Water State Revolving Fund is focused on water projects, and so I'm not going to focus on it too much. But the way it works is that it subsidizes the borrower's interest rate 135 basis points below market. And so that would mean if you started out with a 3% interest rate, you'd subtract 1.35 from that. And if my skills aren't failing me, I think that takes you down to 1.65 as the ending interest rate. So it's there's pretty powerful value right there off the top, just saving you money in terms of the interest that the project costs you over time. The repayment terms go up to 30 years, and the principal forgiveness categories are for disadvantaged communities. That's communities making 75% or less of the statewide median household income. Very small systems, those are systems serving populations of 1,000 or less. Urgent need projects, and so those are, disasters and things of that nature. And projects with green components. And green is kind of a big category, and it can mean anything that's really energy efficiency or improving the efficiency of the system. If you've got some kind of valve that can be operated with a solar panel or something like that, you're probably thinking along the correct lines there. The counterpart to that program is the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So the drinking water is sort of pigeonholed as the water program. The clean water program is pigeonholed as the wastewater program. And so that is not entirely inaccurate, but it's actually more flexible than that, and I'll mention that here in a moment. But it's structured in a very similar way to its counterpart. The financing works by providing an interest rate subsidy, but it's actually a deeper subsidy, 165 basis points. Again, the repayment terms go up to 30 years. And the principal forgiveness categories are not as numerous in this program, but there are still some. We have the disadvantaged communities, disaster relief, and the projects with green components. So that threshold for the disadvantaged eligibility, I mentioned it was 75% of the statewide AMHI. The last time I had checked the statewide AMHI, we used those 5-year ACS data sets. And the last time I checked it, I found $57,051. So 75% of that would make a threshold of $42,788. And what we do is we plug that into a calculation called the household cost factor, which estimates the loan's impact on the average ratepayer in the area. It's fairly straightforward. So just to show you some examples about how real communities are using this funding right now, and forgive me if the animations are a little jumpy. Trust me, they're quite smooth on my screen, but I think we have enough people calling in that it sort of bogged things down. So thank you for calling in and listening, but sorry for the jumpy animations. City of Granbury, using the drinking water program for a treatment plant, meter replacement, and distribution improvement. So a pretty comprehensive project. Pretty expensive too, about $34 million and change. So what we do when we close on one of these financing commitments is we take a look at, well, what if we were not involved, and what if the city had gone for the same amount of financing from a local bank and just had taken a market interest rate? What would the difference have been? And so we found that in this case, the city of Granbury saved about $6 million by using the public financing option. And so if you're listening and you're with the city of Granbury, I hope that they're, having parades and carrying you around the streets on people's shoulders, and you got your key to the city and everything like that, because that's really good public service. And that's kind of the bottom line about what the message we're trying to get out here. Okay, so that's $6 million just by going through the Texas Water Development Board. Let's look at another example. City of Euless has done a lot of work on their reclaimed water system. And this particular tranche of funding was about $2.75 million. And even on a smaller project like this, we compare it to the open market, we see a savings of about $1 million. And again, this is money that the ratepayers, the residents, are not having to pay for this project that they would be paying otherwise. So high five to the city of Euless. Let's check out another one. We got the city of Arlington. Another project of about $4 million here. That's for some sewer lines through the Clean Water SRF program. A lot of lines, 22,000 linear feet. Cost savings compared to the open market, about $1.5 million. Now, in some of these cases, they access the green principal forgiveness, and we factor that into the cost savings. And in some cases, it's really just that interest rate difference over time. It's kind of like when you go out and you buy a car and somebody's offering you a loan at 5%, and the neighboring dealership is offering you one at 2%. Well, I mean, gosh, jump at the 2%. That's essentially what we're representing to you here. The Clean Water program I mentioned gets pigeonholed as a wastewater program, and it really does so much more than that. In Texas, it gets used primarily for things like treatment plants, lift stations, line work, line replacement, and all that. And that's wonderful. We have all kinds of funding to do that with. But it can do a whole lot more. Non-point source pollution control, direct potable reuse, flood control. We've had a lot of interest lately from the land conservation community in using this for conservation easements. So for things of that nature too. In fact, if you have something you want to do, just mention it to us, and then we'll check the federal regs just to make sure it's not eligible in this program. I mentioned the fact that both of the counterpart SRF programs have disaster funding available, and the bottom line there is it's a lot like your disaster funding that you see at the other public financing agencies. It's for declared disasters. It's not for something that results from, a lack of operations and maintenance work or anything like that. Usually if you have an eligible emergency situation, you're going to know it. So these programs operate on an annual cycle, and if you want to, especially if you want to compete for that principal forgiveness, that partial grant, this is going to be really important to learn. The project solicitation starts with project information forms, which is, like a dozen pages that provide some preliminary info about the project, and we use that to do a ranking and a scoring. And then the draft intended use plan is published, and the intended use plan basically describes the program and then lists all the projects and their rank and things like that. The entities who've submitted those projects have a chance to comment, and if everybody kind of ranks, everybody who ranks within the capacity for the pots of money they're going for is invited to come in with that full application. On the date that we're recording this, actually, just before this webinar, we had the public comment session for the draft IUP for this year. So that happens around the summertime. And usually the borrowers are closing on their loans from the first round of invitations sometime in the fall. And so this whole process for those ones that are getting first round invitations for funding, it happens within about a year. Now, this is important because of things like the green funding, the disadvantaged funding, those are limited pots of money within the overall capacity. The overall capacity is enormous. It's enormous. We can sell bonds, so it's theoretically limitless. But the green funding and stuff, that's competitive. And so you want to be sure and get those PIF forms, those project information forms turned in. They're typically due the first week of March. The solicitation starts in December and ends in March. So this is a great time to be learning about the program. If you didn't know about it and you want to get involved for next year, it's a great time to be downloading those forms and taking a look at them. However, not every project is going to be eligible for those special pots of money, but they still get the benefit of this subsidized interest rate, which is pretty powerful. Those projects can actually submit any time throughout the year. And wherever we are in the process, we'll sort of stop and amend the documents and get the project added in and process that subsidized loan for you. The intended use plan is again, that's the document that lists all the projects and it describes the program in great detail. That's where I would recommend those of you who are hoping for more detail, that's where you should look. It's released and updated every year. Talks about the capacity and the flow of money through the program. It describes all the categories and allocations for the green, disadvantaged, et cetera. It also has the listed projects and the ranking criteria. And so the draft intended use plan is currently posted online. There's a link for the program webpage. And as I mentioned today, we have just had the public comment session for this draft. So just like any other federal funding or funding that federal dollars have touched, there are going to be some requirements that come along with it. That's going to include disadvantaged business enterprise procurement requirements, or DBE. It's not going to be a surprise to anyone who has worked with federal funding before. It could be CDBG or USDA or whatever the case may be. We actually have a DBE coordinator on staff, so you don't have to wonder about your procurement and your bid opportunities. You can just copy and paste the language that we give you. You can check with us to make sure that your postings are working correctly so that you can not have to worry about that kind of thing later. There's also federal environmental review requirements. Again, no big surprise if you're familiar with other funding sources. Same with the Davis-Bacon prevailing wage rates and American Iron and Steel. So those are our federal programs, the state revolving funds. Now we're going to turn to our other pile of tools from that toolbox, and that'll be our state-funded programs. And essentially what we're talking about here is where the state has given our agency authority to go out and issue bonds. So we're supported by the full faith and credit of the state of Texas. We enjoy this very strong AAA bond rating, which means that when we go out and sell bonds, we have a cost of funds that's much lower than the interest rate that many other entities would be able to get by doing bond sales. So that AAA bond rating right there, that's like an interest rate subsidization. In some cases, we have grants available, and in some cases, there's deferral, although I don't think we'll be talking about the SWIFT program for today's purposes. So I'll start off by talking about the D fund, which actually doesn't usually get a slide in the workshop because it doesn't really have any special characteristics like subsidization or, the sprinkles on top of the ice cream that really make it attractive. But it is pretty neat because it's got the AAA AAA bond rating, and it has this enormous evergreen bonding authority. So the capacity is essentially limitless. I would be surprised if we've used any more than maybe a couple of those $6 billion. And unique among TWDB programs, if you have a utility that does both water and wastewater and you need work done on both, you can get both done with the same loan if you go through this program, which means if you only want to hire one, attorney and financial advisor and things like that, you could do it this way. We got an example. I couldn't find any examples from your exact neck of the woods on this program, so I went down to Ira Ann, which is a small community off of I-10 in West Texas. And they used defund for a new wastewater treatment plant and some water improvements. So they did this option of taking both water and wastewater funding at the same time. Pretty comprehensive. It's a small town, so looking at this, I mean, they must have really done some work all over the place. Total financing was about $2,375,000. And again, without any sprinkles on the ice cream, this small town was still able to save $247,000, nearly $248,000, compared to the open market. So again, that's really significant, substantial, and high five to the folks down in Ira Ann. Another real popular program we administer is called the EDAP. That stands for Economically Distressed Areas Program. And this is specifically for areas where the income, again, is not greater than 75% of that statewide median, same threshold that we talked about before. I think it was $42,000 and change. The infrastructure in these areas, though, is totally just substandard, or it doesn't exist. And so when I say it doesn't exist, I mean we do a lot of first-time residential water and sewer projects through this program. It was created as a Colonia benefit program back in the early 90s and has kind of expanded to do work statewide since then. So if you're familiar with the Colonia issue, then that's kind of the places that you want to have in mind when you think about EDAP eligibility. We also ask that model subdivision rules be in place. These are basically rules, typically it's the county that adopts these, and it has to do with things like the provision of utilities to residential lots and the number of residential structures on a lot, things of that nature. And it's really just meant to sort of, if you have some substandard development that's getting away from you, you can kind of nip it in the bud using the MSRs, the model subdivision rules. So those are the eligibility criteria for EDAP. And it's very popular because we can use the G word when we're talking about EDAP. It actually does offer grants. And a typical EDAP commitment is going to be a ratio of grant and loan. The specific ratio depends on a lot of factors, but the biggest one is that you need a public health nuisance determination to get greater than 50% grant. We have an agreement with the Texas Department of State Health Services, and they will go out to the area. They'll send a surveyor and kind of take a look around. And if they find things like, like failing septic systems and things of that nature, then there's a public health nuisance, and that warrants greater than 50% of a grant. Now, we haven't talked much about EDAP recently because there hasn't been much capacity to work with. Typically, we'll get $250 million bonding authorities, and then we'll use that, and then the legislature will kind of take the results and consider whether to give us more. This most recent legislative session was a little bit different. We were given $200 million evergreen, so it's actually going to be a revolving bonding authority, but the voters will need to approve it in November. So, I can't tell you how to vote, but I hope that you do. I hope that you take a look at the ballot in November, and I hope you encourage your friends and loved ones to do the same. The new legislation, in addition to providing that opportunity, requires us to prioritize the projects that we get each year. So that's unheard of in EDAP. We did it sort of ad hoc last year. Now it's into legislation. So if you're interested in EDAP, keep an eye on that. We are working on the rules. And again, this is another program where I couldn't find a real good example just off the top of my head in your neck of the woods. So I reached down to one of my, what I consider the quintessential EDAP project. The East Aldine Management District down in Harris County brought first-time water and wastewater service to two areas. And so these are residential areas right off of I-10 as you drive through Houston. No water or wastewater before this project. They had these private septic systems that were failing at a rate of greater than 50%. And they had these tiny lots, which meant that these failing septics are less than 50 feet from the wells that people are using to provide their drinking water. So that was a slam dunk nuisance determination from the Texas Department of State Health Services. And the project is being, or the circumstances are being resolved with an $11 million EDAP project. Now, out of that $11 million, or 10.9 rather, 10.3 was a grant. And so that explains to you how EDAP gets so popular, right? And so it's nice to get a grant, but especially in this case, being eligible for it in the first case, implies that there are some other issues, or it might not be so pleasant. East Aldine in particular, they didn't fare so well through Hurricane Harvey, so it was kind of good that they had some strong new infrastructure in place around that time. Speaking of floods, we have flood protection grant programs. We are the counterpart or the partner for FEMA here in Texas for the flood mitigation assistance and severe repetitive loss programs. There's also some state funding, some grant funding for flood protection planning. Some of you, particularly in the larger cities, I think Fort Worth, for example, has been working with those grants, maybe a couple of others as well. If we are fortunate enough to see you at our next workshop in Arlington, you can expect to hear from some of our flood staff actually presenting this information in much more expert detail than I can provide for you. So I mentioned on those federal programs that they come with requirements, right? There's the DBE procurement requirements, there's American Iron and Steel and all that kind of stuff. Well, the same is true on the state side. It's not exactly the same requirements, but they're in the same spirit. So we check to make sure water conservation and drought contingency plans are in place anytime we finance any more than $500,000 for any project. There is a state environmental review process. There is a state iron and steel, U.S. iron and steel provision. SWIFT used to be immune from that, but actually I need to delete that, those couple of words, because that's not the case anymore. SWIFT is actually subject to it now too. There's also water loss threshold requirements. Many of y'all, if you work for a water utility, you do water loss audits, and you turn the results into our agency actually on a regular basis. We have a water loss threshold for each utility, and if a utility comes to us wanting to borrow money, but they have water loss that's over the threshold, the law says that they can do what they wanted to do initially, but they also need to borrow money to take care of that water loss. So there are some rules that go along with the state programs too. Now, the way that we deliver these services to local communities is we have regional teams. There are 6 TWDB regions in the state. And the way that we got the boundaries for these regions is we followed the Regional Water Planning Group boundaries. And so on the map that's on your screen now, these shaded regions are the Regional Water Planning Groups. And if you're on the water side of things, you probably know what that means. And if not, don't worry about it for now. But then the red lines that you see on the map, those are showing the boundaries of our regions. So I took a look at the map on y'all's, on the COG website, and I think most of you fall within regions 2 and 3. So your managers for those regions would be Karen Skrabarczyk and Louis Farias, both longtime TWDB folks, and both actual former financial analysts. So they have particular strength in that area. And I mentioned at the beginning that we don't expect you to be an expert on everything before you come in and talk to us. And that's really true. We have what we call pre-application meetings. If you were to come in with an application for one of those SRF programs, we would actually require an a pre-application meeting. And what that is it gives you a chance to sit down, bring over your engineer and attorney and whoever else you would like to bring, and they talk to their counterparts on our side. So we have our engineer and our finance person and our manager, and everybody gets to ask their questions from their point of view, and you can talk through every page on the application if you'd like to. But the idea is at the end, when you fill out the app, you're not playing any guessing games. You're not worried that you'll have to word things in a certain way. Nothing like that. We also will receive an application that is cleaner. It's something that is not full of surprises. We can review it more quickly. It's also a good idea to build rapport with your regional team because they will review the application, they will recommend it to the board, and then they will be the ones handling your reimbursement requests as you work through the project. So hey, why not put a face with a name? You don't even have to come to Austin to do it. We typically do these over the phone. But in the example you're seeing here, the utility came in from, I believe it was Harris County, somewhere out east. The application process is something we try to make as simple as possible. The applications can be done on paper, but we also have an online system if you want to apply online. If you work for a more rural utility and you fill out those TDA applications for the block grants and you use the census data a lot, you might have found that that census website is not a lot of fun to use. We actually plug their data into ours, and so you could create a dummy application on ours and start filling it out and just type in the name of a community and get the census info, and it might be a little more pleasant to use than the census website. So you can apply for our programs through the online application system. You can use it to get your census data. I do recommend checking it out because we're starting to get more than half of our submittals through this method. But of course, we do always have the paper version available. So I have spent the past few minutes talking about our project financing, and that's definitely the focus of this presentation. But those of you who are not familiar with us might not realize how much else we do as an agency. So I want to kind of brag about my coworkers here at the end. The green bar here on the screen says science. We have an entire science division of the agency that does things like stream flows and aquifer mapping and meteorology and just a long list of really incredible, interesting stuff. They research innovative technologies like seawater desalination, aquifer storage and recovery, pretty neat stuff like that. We'll take a look at their weather data website here in a moment. The orange, sort of burnt orange bar there says planning. We put out the state water plan each year. We help out and support regional water planning groups as they develop regional water plans. And we also do water use surveys, which some of you might have filled out if you work for water utilities. On the right-hand side, that blue one says data. And we are the state's official repository for mapping and GIS. That's something you might not realize. That we have a division called the Texas Natural Resources Information System, which has mapping data for every square inch of the state of Texas. It's pretty amazing, and these resources are available to the public. So together they do a lot of neat projects, and I'm going to show you a couple of them here as I approach the close of the presentation. The state water plan, if you live in Texas and if you drink water, you should check out the interactive state water plan. You don't have to be an engineer, you don't have to be an elected official or a financier or anything like that. All this is it's going to tell you over the next 50 years, where's your water expected to come from, where does it come from now, how's it going to shift, and are the plans really enough? So this is a really, really neat website and a neat tool that we've developed. For the purpose of this presentation, I typed in Fort Worth. And it looks like we got some shortages here, some potential water shortages over the next 50 years. I'll keep you in suspense. If you were to scroll down a little bit, you would find the strategies that need to be implemented to try to make up some of those shortages, as well as a bunch of other really neat information. The TexMesonet.org is the weather data website that we operate. And it usually helps if it's kind of stormy at the time that I do these presentations, but man, things were pretty dry in y'all's area at the time that I was putting this presentation together. But as you can see, there's a lot of really neat meteorological data that we track and provide in a real-time basis through a number of different weather stations around, in this example, around Fort Worth. But they're sprinkled all over the state. Similarly, we have the TexasFlood.org with a similar map showing flood gauges. And so for this example, I took a look at the Clear Fork of the Trinity River at Fort Worth. Good news, it was not flooded. But you could see on the day that I took this, if we look to the right, over between Coppell and Carrollton, looks like there was some potential, maybe some minor flooding out in that area at that time. Another cool website that we operate is Water Data for Texas. And what we're looking at here is reservoirs throughout Texas, plus the Elephant Butte Reservoir in New Mexico. The size of the circle tells you how big it is, and the color tells you how full it is. And the menu up at the top, you can see we also have info on drought, groundwater, and coastal specific information. So that's a kind of an example of what we provide, a very quick example. The agency is really set up to provide data that supports planning. The planning results in projects. We have the financing to finance your projects, and that puts you in a position where you can plan ahead for the next one. And that's kind of, we're there to support this entire sort of cycle that keeps on going as communities grow and develop and infrastructure keeps, aging out and needing to be replaced and expanded and things like that. So I'm going to introduce our two regions that I think most of you fall into. The first is the Brazos region, or Team 2. The manager is Karen Skrabarczyk. The counties, hopefully you can make that out on the screen. A couple of the key names on here, Connie Townsend and Juan Moran Lopez are going to be main engineers on the team. Marcus Snell, a recent addition to the team. Stephen Bell. This team is very strong in engineers, holy cow. Kevin Smith, project manager. I think we snagged him from the TCEQ. Lena Linehan is the financial analyst on the team. Chris Caron, he's just a monster in environmental issues here in Texas. He's the environmental reviewer on the team, really interesting guy. So is Joe Reynolds, the attorney on that team. If you attend water planning group meetings in the area, you might have met Aaron Waters. The next one is me. I manage the program administration team. And on my team, I have the coordinators that handle the financial assistance programs I talked about. So Taylor handles drinking water, Issa handles clean water, and Kimberly handles everything else. And then we'll be looking for a DBE coordinator here recently. Similar lineup in the Team 3 region for those of you closer to the Dallas side of things. Luis Farias is your team manager. Joe Cohen is the senior engineer on the team. Michael Brooks provides a lot of project management support. We actually have a field office in Mesquite. Rafael Castro and Dean Crenshaw are out there. It's a pretty cozy little office. You should go pay them a visit if you ever get the chance. Ben Munguia is the financial analyst on the team. Rachel Forster, a recent addition in the environmental review spots. Ashley Nwanima is the attorney. And most of the names after that stay the same. Ron Ellis is the planner for that region. Now, if you want to know who to call to move forward or to ask questions, these are the folks whose names you should have in the Rolodex if you're interested in wastewater utilities. Luis Farias is going to be the manager again for Team 3, Karen for Team 2, and they, so you saw that their staff includes expertise in engineering, finance, project management, environmental review. They are your gatekeeper to all of this knowledge, and they'll kind of refer you as appropriate to the folks to answer your questions. But the idea is that whatever your angle is on this, you should have an expert here at TWDB that's ready to answer the question for you. Issa McDaniel is an engineer in addition to being the clean water coordinator, so he's a great person to bounce ideas off of. So you should certainly copy down his information as well. So that is the end of my presentation. I just wanted to point out that we're hiring like crazy here at the Water Development Board. We're one of the top workplaces for the second year in a row here in Austin. And thanks again to the North Central Texas COG for inviting me to give you this presentation here today. I hope that it was informative. And big thanks to those of you listening, took time out of your day to do this, especially those of you that are operators at water or wastewater systems. You guys are the unsung public health heroes in our local communities, so thank you.